A major challenge for working data scientists is facilitating the process of answering key business questions, using data, and delivering the results to decision makers in a way that is both clear and truthful. Alexander Thor, Senior Product Manager at Vizlib, joins us today to explore some of the challenges faced by modern data professionals. We discuss his experiences, insights, and what role Astrato plays in the greater data ecosystem.
Hi, my name is Alexander Thor. I currently work within product management at a company called Vizlib, and we build a analytics product called Astrato Analytics, which is born in the cloud, built for the cloud, sort of in that modern data stack world. I've worked within business intelligence or data analytics for the last good parts of a decade, so that's me in a nutshell.
And what have you learned on that career in analytics?
Most of the analytics, I think, really varies depending on who you talk to. If you talk to smaller companies, larger companies, old companies versus new companies, but also if the data analytics side, it has grown. The field has grown vastly, I would say, over the last kind of decade. A decade ago, nobody were talking about machine learning or AI. That didn't really exist outside of perhaps Google. So I think that the field has vastly expanded over the last decade, really gone from just being reporting and prescriptive analysis to becoming a real field in that sense. So I think that has probably been the major shift. I would hope that I would say that, I'm seeing more and more successful analytics projects. I'm not sure that is the case, but at least more people are using analytics in some shape or form.
Maybe we should get into definitions. What do you mean when you say analytics?
The way that I would define analytics for me, so I'm mostly on the side of visualization side of the house. So I'm less about machine learning and AI, for example. So for me, in the fancy terms these days is either, dashboarding or building data apps or data experiences. So it's more around working with data that perhaps exists, more perhaps in a prescriptive manner or a descriptive manner or prescriptive manner. So that's usually how I would define analytics in my world. Now, analytics these days can mean anything. Maybe even reaching into the data engineering side of the house, or even going as far as going down to ML and AI and those areas as well.
Yeah, definitely growing. I know in the earliest days of, let's say, the late 90s, when the web was kind of kicking off, a lot of companies thought, well, it's enough that our transactional system is up and running. This BI stuff will have to come later and be an afterthought. And now it seems a lot of companies lead day zero with the right tools in place. What's really changed in this time that's enabled that process?
I think the barrier to entry has gotten much lower, definitely. Tools and software, of course, has gotten a lot better. But the main thing, I think, is the barrier to entry. You no longer need to be a massive corporation with a huge IT budget to go and purchase a data warehouse anymore. You don't need to employ a small army of data engineers to manage said on-prem warehouse anymore. So the barrier to entry has definitely gotten lower. So I think that has really opened up sort of the field of analytics to a much larger audience. But also, I think people embrace data in a different sense these days as well. And as to why that is, I can only guess. But I think a lot of macroeconomic influences in the world has come to fruition, and a lot of things are just going a lot faster these days as well, which means that if you aren't on top of your analytics game, then it's much easier to go out of business perhaps now than it were maybe 20, 30 years ago.
And have you seen any trends on where the data lives? I know Snowflake has certainly been a unicorn and a growing player in the field. Are there other players in the field you're keeping an eye on, or where do people warehouse their data these days?
I would say probably the majority of companies are still warehousing on-prem in the traditional databases, but the shift is definitely there. I would say Snowflake kind of led the charge there with, removing these barriers to entry, where you can quite easily sign up for something in the cloud that just kind of magically scales itself, right? And just the fact that you're separating storage from compute these days as well. But we're definitely looking at other players such as Databricks, which we're heavily monitoring and are very impressed by as well. But even more traditional stuff like Postgres and those areas are picking up for smaller sizes, of course.
Well, there's a lot of effort put into getting that infrastructure to work, but of course, if I pick a cloud solution, that's someone else's problem. So if I know I have the scalability of the cloud, what kinds of questions can I start to ask that maybe were difficult to ask in the past?
I think you can probably ask the same questions, but I think you can ask more questions on a larger set of data. So, data is still complex. The problem of understanding data and ingesting data hasn't become much easier because data is still a complex topic, like inherently. But the time to kind of getting a data pipeline up and running into sort of a modern data storage solution like Snowflake, for example, or the modern warehouse is much shorter. So I think you're probably asking the same questions with some tweaks, of course, but you're asking more of them. No longer do you have to wait the month or 2 months for a new data set to be ingested, or my on-prem warehouse toppled over whenever I wanted to bring in some new data. So now I need to go make a purchase order to buy more hardware and actually install it. And these days, it's no longer months, it's a matter of weeks or even days.
So we've seen a lot of growth in this area, a lot of new technologies coming out. I'm wondering if we could rewind to 2020. I'm reminded of how people, especially on LinkedIn or wherever, they love to show these, images of all the logos they've put together, the data companies, and it's this kind of overwhelming landscape. What was going on in 2020 where Vizlib said, we need to build something new? It's time to launch Astrato.
So Astrato is a new analytics tool, which is kind of built on the foundation that you shouldn't really move data around. And if we look at sort of more traditional analytical tools or BI, business intelligence tools, they've always kind of lived on this premise that to be able to achieve great performance, because the data warehouse were slow in the past and hard to scale, you had to kind of move data outside of your data warehouse. So you would cache it somewhere, or you would transform it into more fit for purpose dashboarding models or what have you not. And you would disconnect the data from your data warehouse, essentially. And I would say most of the tools in the market today were based and founded on that premise. And that premise or that problem statement isn't really true anymore. These days, you can scale your data warehouse with sort of the click of a button or running a little bit of a command line script. And all of a sudden, your warehouse is just scaling magically in the cloud. So there's no longer a need for kind of moving the data outside of your data warehouses anymore. And at the same time, there's more and more consumers of data. No longer is it only business intelligence or reporting. As we talked about before, you have machine learning models, you have some AI running, perhaps you're building other type of data apps, and so on and so forth. So the amount of consumers of data has vastly increased. So you can't really move data around anymore, because at the end of the day, the people that are using the data in different tools or for different purposes still needs to talk to each other. And when you start moving the data around, you end up in this classical problem where somebody will ask you, where did you get that number from? How do you derive that number? And when data is sitting in multiple different places, in different silos, in various shapes and forms, that question gets really hard to answer. So we saw this opportunity to create an analytical tool for sort of the modern stack, which means that it shouldn't be based on the premise that you need to move data around. And it should be based on a language that has come back in popularity again, which is SQL. So the ability to actually build data apps and dashboarding, kind of merge the no-code side with dashboarding to also create data experiences without the data having to leave your data warehouses. That was kind of the driving factor for building Astrato.
Yeah, I think most data professionals will be pretty clear that you shouldn't be moving data around in that fashion. That wasn't the right strategy. And I don't know that what I'm going to describe next is a true dichotomy, but another route you could go would be to focus on in-memory systems, and a lot of things went that route. Why go and process the data where it lives instead of in-memory? Do you have any thoughts on this design choice?
So in-memory was a great option back in the day, mostly because you were processing it in memory because of performance and speed reasons. So you could join up disjointed data sets in memory. You could perform computational metrics on top of these data sets in memory, and you got blazingly fast speed. You had some vendors going down to sub-second response times on performing calculations on top of the data without having to pre-calculate stuff. So that was pretty amazing. But when we look at the vendors of today, you have the same or very equal performance as you have in memory. You have that in the modern data warehouses today without having the need of putting your data into memory. Technology has caught up, so the performance isn't no longer the key reason there anymore. So in memory, technology has more become a constraint because it constrains you on how much data you can actually put into memory. There's only so much RAM you can have on a machine. So it still gives you performance, but it also gives you constraints to put it in memory. But when you take away the performance bit, it's just constraints left. So I would say if you're kind of building software today, you wouldn't go with the memory option. For the same reason that it's also very costly and expensive to scale memory in the cloud as well.
Well, having SQL be the kind of lingua franca is very appealing to me. It's a language I've seen a lot of people, even non-technical people, be able to learn and be very effective with. So that is a strong appeal to go that direction. I already get SQL in Snowflake. What does Astrato give me on top of that?
What Astrada does is that we allow users to assemble visualizations or other type of data objects by interacting with the data on sort of a higher abstraction layer almost. So if you wanted to write SQL, you of course can do that, but in a more of a kind of no-code drag and drop type of fashion where a user can come in and say, very Tableau-esque, pick a dimension, pick a field, some aggregation method, perhaps some in visualization filters, and it will actually generate and construct a SQL query behind that and then execute that on top of your warehouse. So we actually generate SQL based on sort of user interaction with the system, which isn't new or novel in any shape or form. A lot of different vendors have done this before. I think what we've always said is that treat SQL as a language. Don't output unreadable garbage. So the queries that actually gets generated is still, they're of course machine readable, but they should also be human readable. Because at the end of the day, you need to take this query and perhaps give it to somebody else or be able to replicate the same result in a different department that aren't perhaps using the same tooling as you are, and so on and so forth.
Earlier, you'd used the term data app, I think maybe in contrast to the term dashboard. Do you draw a firm distinction there? And if so, what is it?
So for me, I actually heard a very good analogy of this from Chief Data Officer at Mode, where he was talking about Yelp as a typical data app. Yelp, for me, it isn't really a dashboard, but it's very much driven by data. You go and look at, for example, restaurants, and you form your decision based on some type of data. How many reviews are there? What's the average? Maybe you find a 5-star restaurant that looks really good, but only have 2 reviews. Well, that's probably not as reliable as I want it to be, and so on and so forth. And you craft this like really interactive experiences, which is solely powered by data, which is for me is really interesting. And that's a typical data app for me.
So if I'm an Astrato user, can you describe what palette of options are there waiting for me?
So we've kind of taken the approach of combining similar like a no-code experience with the data side and the visual side. So of course you can build dashboards with the standard and typical type of visualizations that you're used to, but we also give you sort of the full flexibility to really style and also build in logic and interactivity into your dashboard so they can take that step from being just a dashboard to actually become more of an app where you perhaps not only look at data, but you're also interacting with data. You're perhaps even generating data points back to some type of store, or maybe even coding logic to guide your users down a specific path, for example, of analysis. So it's combining sort of that visual programming together with building your actual data experiences. Granted, it can still do dashboarding, and it does dashboarding really well. But for me, dashboarding is just part of the beginning. It's not the end goal.
I'm wondering if you've seen any, like a power user who's done something particularly clever or novel that epitomizes the product. Is there a use case you can share?
Sure. We've seen people, for example, building very kind of in-depth applications that guides users down sort of a flow of analysis. And why I'm kind of describing this, and it can be very simple things, such as when you start off in a dashboard, you're perhaps looking at high-level metrics, but as you're kind of progressing down through your analysis and drilling down into reporting, you're getting down to like single record views, perhaps even, if you wanted to look something up, or constraining certain views to having the user has to select specific dimensional values to be able to get the view to render, but crafting it in such a way that the user feel like this app is actually native, like somebody built it for this purpose specifically. And that really helped them to get adoption among those users because they could build that specific application for a very specific problem and not having to kind of just give the users a couple of charts and hope they do the right thing.
And do you have a vision of who the typical workaday user is that's really in there building systems? What type of data professional is most active?
This one has actually surprised us. We've been in this field for such a long time, and the go-to answer is it's always a data analyst that kind of understands the business somehow. But we're actually seeing this kind of moving further out into the business as well, where especially younger people today can really like pick up these tools and start creating something that is really, really, really amazing. And we have, the ability to build logic layers and kind of visual programming, and they really picked this up really, really fast. And in areas that I wouldn't assume, where you see marketing associates starting to visually program data apps. I didn't think that would happen, but apparently it is. So
I've also been impressed by some of the people specifically in marketing groups who adapt technologies and really run with it. So in some ways, not surprised. Do you have a sense of what typical collaborations are like? I could always build my own master dashboard for myself, but I find some of the most pleasing times in my career is when I've delivered something that, an executive needs and is going to look at every day. What does the general collaboration on the platform come down to?
So for us, this is definitely an area that we're wanting to build more and more in. So of course, for us, it's facilitating kind of like collaboration in the tool as well. But I think what a mistake a lot of people try to do is that they're trying to build collaboration just within their software. And I think we need to realize that collaboration doesn't just happen in one type of software. It happens on Slack, or it happens over Google Meets, or it happens in other various shape or form, right? And this is still early days for us. So we're still exploring these concepts of how to take assets kind of out of the different apps or dashboards and start integrating them into other tools without necessarily just producing an image. So how we can generate kind of live and interactive visualizations with controls such as filters or sliders that you can embed somewhere else and say something like, hey, have a look at this. And you send a group of controls and visualizations, for example, to a colleague over Slack, and you can interact directly in Slack and discuss this type of data. I think that is really important as well. And not only constrain it down to having a software license for all of the users in the company.
In that regard, I know you have some limits put on you by the Slack API that I have a pretty good familiarity with. You can't necessarily add a slider or things like that. Are there any design challenges you have in dealing with the format that Slack will allow you to work within?
Slack is always a tricky one, but for us, we can almost, from a dashboard or from a data app, we can generate almost a micro UI of various components that you want to assemble. As a user, so no coding needed or anything along those lines. And then that little micro UI can then be shared either as a standalone site, or you can kind of embed it somewhere else. So that's our end goal there. So we would love for it to become sort of a native plugin for Slack, but I think that's still some ways to go.
Well, I know one of the tools that people have a variety of feelings about, but you can't deny its presence in the data space, and that's Excel. It's, one of the things that it's great for is that anybody can seem to get a handle on it, and you can't hurt yourself too bad. There's a limited amount of data there. If I'm dealing in the big data realm, do I need some sort of background in big data to be able to use Astrato? Or could someone with, an Excel background who kind of fell into data get up and running pretty quick?
If you fell into data and if you know Excel, you're definitely up and running. So I started, you don't have to understand SQL, for example, to be able to ingest data, as long as the data, of course, is nicely prepared. And to be able to start interacting with the data, you can definitely get up and running straight away. So big data for us isn't necessarily a constraint there. Exploring, for example, unstructured data, I think you need a little bit of experience, a little bit of know-how to make actually solid analysis out of. But other than that, you can definitely get up and running and start it quite quickly.
There's a version of a BI professional who wants to kind of deliver dashboards and maybe data apps, and once they're done, they're done. I mean, maybe there's a bug or something that has to be fixed, but it's sort of a unit of delivery you give to the business that you work for, and they can run with it from there. On the other hand, there's like when I think of a SQL interface, it's something I'm using for ad hoc queries on a day-to-day basis. And maybe I don't really make anything permanent the way I make my dashboards permanent. Where does Astrato fit along the lines of, the gallery of beautiful things we've created to the tool I use on a daily basis asking questions?
I would say we fall somewhere in between. So I'll preface that by saying if a dashboard becomes permanent, I think it's a dead dashboard. Mostly because your business changed, right? Your data changes. The types of question you want to ask, that dashboard changes over time. So unless the dashboard actually adapts to your business as well, it's a dead dashboard. The amount of dashboards that get built every day is probably way more than what's actually used. So I'm very happy for somebody to come in and create a dashboard and then throw it away 3-4 days later. That's ideal, right? Because then it served its purpose and then you can retire it. And if it's for a larger user audience, then of course it might have a longer life cycle. But I think it's important to understand that a dashboard has a life cycle. It doesn't just gets deployed and that's the end of it. I think it has a story after that as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If I were to contrast what you described, though, to something like a formal software release process, I could see a release manager being very nervous about this. The dashboards evolve and change so much that there's no control and structure. Are these not the same environment, or do you think it's just that maybe BI will eventually evolve into a more formal process?
I would separate the two. So if my worry there stems from, and this is especially with traditional BI, right? Because if I have a very high pace of innovation or a very high pace of change in my business intelligence system, my worry here is because how do I maintain data lineage? How do I maintain data governance? How do I make sure that whenever we change something downstream, that it's reflected and up to date in all of my dashboards. And you have this worry because you have disconnected your data from the original data warehouse. But when your data actually resides in your data warehouse, that worry becomes less and less, because however you manage your data warehouse, whether it be dbt or some other tool, you get sort of that full impact analysis now, and you can actually understand whenever a data pipeline job failed, which dashboards are now impacted. We want to make a change in this definition, which dashboards will be impacted, and so on and so forth. So BI doesn't become this black hole anymore that it used to be in the past, where it's like we have this really cool governed data store, and then something goes to BI and we have no idea what's happening anymore. I think we're getting away from that, right? And I think that's part of sort of the core of the modern data stack, that it actually, we're moving more and more back to concepts that were popular in the 90s, right? We're coming back to the single source of truth. We're coming back to centralized data warehousing again. I would challenge that worry. I definitely would. And if my business has a very high pace of innovation and rapidly keeps changing all of their dashboards, well, isn't that a good thing? Don't they have a lot of questions then that they're actually getting answered? That's something that I would probably embrace than trying to prevent. So,
as you point out, some of these concepts, like single source of truth, this is not a new idea. Why is now the time where it's being taken more seriously?
I've given a lot of thought into this, and of course, technology has some parts in it, right? So players like Snowflake has become a de facto standard almost, together with Databricks and a few other vendors. Performance is a lot better. But for me, when I kind of look at it, I think it's still the same amount of people doing data work, or perhaps even more. But before, you needed a sort of an army of people just to maintain your servers and maintain your on-prem installation and make sure that the lights are on. That type of work is not really needed when you have a managed service, because somebody else is doing it for you. So that means I no longer have to spend time doing that. I can actually spend time on value-adding activities, such as going out into the business and finding new data sources that we can start ingesting in. Or we can go and have a talk with the business on what type of data they're lacking and see if we can find it somewhere. So we've freed up a bunch of time at these individuals so they can actually start producing more value-generating activities than just kind of keeping the lights on in a lot of sense. So I think that has been a big contributing factor, because we're really seeing data engineering teams taking off, data engineering teams becoming de facto standard at almost every size of businesses, even from smaller startup shops to more established almost enterprises. And these are no longer a cost center, which as they were viewed as back in the 90s. Now they're actually a value-adding, generating department, which is, for me, has really accelerated this entire movement.
Yeah, the barrier to entry is much lower, the cost is lower. It seems like the world should be primed for more successful data and analytics projects. But if I understood you correctly, I think you expressed some hesitation at the beginning of our conversation that you weren't sure if there was being a lot more success despite more projects. Did I hear that correct, and can you expand on that?
I still think at the end of the day, I think we're doing quite well in kind of data-versed communities, or people that are data literate. I think we're doing quite well there. Where I think we're not doing as well is perhaps teaching data concepts to people that it's not their job. So how do we make other areas of the business more data literate so they can also then start understanding data and kind of incorporating data into their day-to-day? I haven't seen a lot of push there lately, mostly because I think it has less to do with software and more with soft and people skills. But I think that's a large portion of why projects are failing today, or just not seeing the usage that they could, and especially when it comes to dashboarding.
You hit on one idea I spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's sort of what are the roles currently as data professionals? I can't imagine that there's a one-size-fits-all, I'm full stack, I can do everything from dashboard to business communication to deep learning. Certainly not to be an expert at everything along the way. Have you seen any successful structural patterns? What are the ways in which organizations who are doing a good job organizing themselves to make sure the whole organization benefits from the data?
I definitely think some of the software companies out there today are doing quite well here. Thinking of the likes of Spotify, for example, where data is really at the core of their business, where you actually start looking at embedding data scientists, data analysts, and even data engineers into departments, which we're seeing that success being scaled across other types of businesses now as well. I'm not sure that is the end goal. I think it's a great way of getting a data knowledgeable person closer to the business. But it's not really solving the core of the issue, right? It's like, how do you teach the business to become data literate? I haven't seen a good solution for that yet. No silver bullet.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that's an ongoing process, like trying to live a healthier life, right? It's one step at a time.
Yeah, definitely.
Along those lines, I'm curious if you could put yourself in the role of someone who is struggling in that way, a data professional trying to share insights with executives that are used to going on instinct. Are there any techniques for their approach to how they do dashboarding and presenting data that might be effective in easing that journey along?
Sure. I have a daughter that is just about to turn 3. And sometimes then, falsely, I would say that treat your managers as toddlers. Because sometimes that kind of holds true. If you have something that has worked for a long time, making decisions based on gut instinct, it's not going to change overnight. Sadly, it won't. So it's a process that you have to build over time and definitely try to guide them down the path. And especially as a then kind of toddler, distract them a little bit, dangle some candy in front of them. Here's some shiny graphs that might help along your journey. It might not be best practice. You might even throw a pie chart in there, but perhaps over time you can start reducing the candy and start teaching them a little bit more knowledge. So that's the way that I've gone about it. I shouldn't say I've always been very successful. Definitely not. But for me, it's try to reaffirm what they're doing, because a lot of the times they're probably correct as well, but show them where data can offer improvements or build upon the strengths that they already have. Trying to make somebody change is the hardest thing you can do. So,
are you seeing any adoption patterns in the types of organizations that are having success with Astrato?
Start small. Don't overdo it, I think, is a key. And especially don't wait for everything to be perfect. I think it's better to roll something small out, something that is quote unquote easy, and then iterate on top of it together with the business. If you're waiting for that perfect app or that perfect dashboard to appear, it will probably never happen. And if you build too long towards that kind of perfection goal without actually involving your users, the requirements and the questions will probably have changed. So the underlying foundation that you started with is no longer valid. So I would definitely say kind of rapid iteration, starting small and easy, and then over time build complexity. I think that's a key success metric that we've seen.
That makes sense, yeah. Well, a lot of times when I find something that's useful to me, it solves an old problem and creates a new one. Astrato seems like a really easy way to create dashboards based on all my data, pivot tables, anything I need, very flexible in how I can structure it. So I can probably create a lot more dashboards, which in and of itself is not necessarily a virtue. I need to create useful ones and insightful ones. Are there any design principles or ideas that you keep in mind that might help someone who's now unlocking their zest for building these things?
And now I'm going to sound like a boring old man, right? But at the end of the day, you come back to the same principles that actually has been established for quite a long time, such as the DAR concept. You start with dashboarding, analysis, reporting. So going from high-level metrics and KPIs to grab attention, dive into exploratory analysis. And then at the end of the day, you can never forget sort of that reporting piece, which I think a lot of people miss. So the ability to actually look at data, right? Look at data in a tabular format. Have a really good table where you can easily scroll through the different data sets that also then gets filtered by your journey through the data. And this isn't a new concept at all, I would say. It's been around for a long, long time. But it kind of follows the human mind on how you traverse data. Something that catches your interest, you're exploring it, and at the end of the day, you're kind of looking at for validation or, I actually want to see the data points. But don't forget about the table. I think that is really important. Otherwise, they will right-click and say send to Excel.
Yeah, good point. Well, could you tease us with a few things that are on the roadmap or maybe recent releases you're excited about?
Something that really excites me, and since we sit very close to the source data, we don't disconnect you from the warehouse. That means you're always kind of sitting close to the data, sitting close to up-to-date data as well. You can start reimagining like how you think about data flows. And for me, like you looked at a dashboard and this is interesting, but why can't I interact with my dashboard as I can interact with my stock app on my phone? Like I want to be able to set an alert, right? So whenever something happens or something reaches a certain threshold, something else should happen. So we're looking or aiming to launch a kind of like a workflow builder that allows you to build these type of workflows based on data as input, but it can also be output from data, where you can set up things like alerting, or you can send jobs, or whenever somebody clicks a little button in an application, send a extract of the data to HubSpot or to some MailChimp or some email marketing or whatever it might be. This is something that like really excites me because it takes that step further than just looking at a dashboard into like what happens afterwards.
Well, it's absolutely a visual tool, so we can certainly discuss it as we've done today, but I think listeners should have some understanding of how the pieces all fit together. Is there a preferred link or video or something like that where people can get a good sense of what the capabilities are?
I would recommend everybody just to go to Astrada.io, which is our main website. And from there, you can always sign up to the tool. The tool is perpetually free for 5 users. There's no time limit. There's no restrictions in terms of number of applications or data sizes or anything along those lines. So we wanted the full application to be free for up to 5 users. So it's always low barrier to entry, easy to test. I think that's becoming the mantra of every software out there today.
Any onboarding advice for getting successful when you're spinning it up?
I think it is, as with every kind of data tool, if you don't have any data, it doesn't make a lot of sense to look at data tools. So I would have some data at hand that you want to analyze, whether it's in Google spreadsheets or in Postgres or in Snowflake, that you could easily start ingesting and actually having a go at, twisting and turning on that data, visualizing it in different ways, or whatever it might be. That's usually where I would start. Of course, we're offering some sample data sets, but your own data is always more interesting.
You have the opportunity to observe a lot of companies and where they're at with data maturity. Is there anything noteworthy you can share about where different organizations are at in terms of adopting better data practices?
I think the field of data right now is in a very interesting space where we're almost seeing this divide kind of happening. So the world is divided enough, and now it seems that the space of data is getting divided as well, where you have this kind of old versus new. You go to any of these software sites these days from a new tool and you look at the logos and you don't see any Fortune 500 companies. I think an interesting question is to ask why. And at the same time, we're seeing all of these new businesses popping up and reaching kind of global success overnight, such as Airbnb or Yelp or Uber or Spotify or Netflix. Well, not overnight, they've been around for a while, but that really are adopting and living by these data principles. So I would consider them almost like the new guard. And then you have the old guard, which is still kind of catching up in a sense. They're not really there anymore. So I think what's really happened is like the lower barrier to entry has kind of turned the data space on its head. Before, you needed to have a lot of money, you needed to have a lot of personnel to be able to do really interesting data projects. And that is definitely not the case anymore. It's almost like all of that old legacy is now becoming a hindrance to actually getting good data penetration into your business. So.
Well, any advice then, I guess, for maybe an entrepreneur or young professional who's in the space? How can they sort through the deluge of options out there and find what works for them?
If there's anything there's not a shortage of right now, there's data startups. So, we're one of many. So I'm throwing bricks in a glass house here. Is that what you say in English? I think it is.
It is, yes.
So, there's a slew of tools out there, right? So you're almost getting to like a software fatigue kind of state. I would always recommend nail the basics. Don't get too caught up in chasing the latest software trend, because at the end of the day, data as a field hasn't evolved way too much over the last couple of years. The technology has gotten a lot better. It's got a lot more accessible, but doing an average over on a dimensionality that doesn't fit it still happens. So I would focus on the basics. I would definitely learn some visual best practices, which I think is Tableau held that standard high for a while, but definitely learn some visual best practices when it comes to how to visualize data as most effectively as possible.
Well, Alexander, is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
They definitely can. So I'm a millennial, which means I sit in this awkward phase where I created my Twitter handle when I was 14, which is now coming back to haunt me when I'm grown up. But you can always find me on Twitter under the handle Mindspank. Arguably, it was very cool when I was 14, not so much anymore. But you can find me there. You can always hit me up on LinkedIn if so, or catch me in various Slack channels such as the DBT or Snowflake Slack channels. You'll find me there as well.
Sounds good. We'll link to that in the show notes. Alexander, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That concludes another installment of Data Skeptic Physically Distributed. Myself, Claudia Armbruster, as associate producer, Vanessa Bly, guest coordinator, show notes written by David Abembe, and our host, Kyle Polich.